it was about a 3% increase overall for the total numbers, 7,314 hate crimes compared to 7,120 in 2018. Now, every year since 1991, when they started collecting this data, race-based hate crimes have always been the most numerous. So remember, there were about 7,000. Of that 7,000, about 3,900 were based on race, and the vast majority directed at Black folks. That's not new. The anti-Latinx hate crimes increased for the fourth straight year, up to 527. That's about a 9% increase. And I'll note the highest on record since 2010. And then, of course, religious-based hate crimes are typically the second most numerous. And that was a 14% increase against Jews and Jewish institutions. So as a pattern, anti-Black racism, anti-Semitism, xenophobia, and in particular, anti-Latinx hate.
Yeah. And unfortunately, too, we hear about some of the high profile incidents, but we don't get 7,000 some odd covered on the news. We would remember that. I mean, people would see that every day, but that just isn't put out there in the way it should be.
Well, none of it is put out there in the way it should be. Let's talk about the hate crime statistics report and the act itself. The numbers are always lower than what have the hate crimes that actually have taken place. The thing about the FBI statistics is that their law enforcement agencies are not mandated to report what happened. They are required or asked to report. There are about 18,000 federal, state, and city enforcement authorities who are asked to submit their hate crime statistics to the FBI. And we know that they don't do it. The report itself, the FBI's data, includes all the police agencies that either report one or more hate crimes or affirmatively report that there's zero hate crimes. Too many agencies don't report data at all. So we estimate that there are probably about 250,000 hate crimes and hate incidents that occur annually in the U.S. Let that sink in for a moment.
Wow.
Yeah.
How did the Southern Poverty Law Center arrive at that number?
Well, you can just look at crime statistics, and though they're not marked as hate crimes, if you look at the statistics that are turned in annually about from the Uniform Crime Reporting System, you can discern what happened in the commission of that crime. And so whether or not it was identified as a hate crime, if you look at the circumstances surrounding it, you can surmise that it was. Now, it's really important for people to know that a hate crime is an enhancement on an existing crime. So a crime has to have taken place, say murder. Then law enforcement must prove that the primary motivation for the commission of this crime was based on bias. They have to prove that. So many law enforcement agencies either don't want to take that extra step and prove that it was a hate crime. For some, it's enough just to prove the crime and close the case. And I will add that it's a challenge. It's a bit of a challenge to prove motivation, right? You have to prove that it was motivated in whole or in part based on this bias. So we look at it in terms of lack of training in law enforcement, a lack of education around hate crimes. The impact that hate crimes have not only on the individual that was victimized, but also on the community members. Because the difference between a hate crime and any other crime is that I'm targeted for a hate crime because of who I am, something about me. So when that kind of crime takes place, people that look like me or share the same characteristics as me also are fearful that they're going to be next. And that's why we think it's so important that law enforcement is trained in it develops relationships with community members so that they report hate crimes and hate incidents. So then maybe we can do something to push back on these numbers.
And so when you talk about law enforcement, we're talking about jurisdictional at the local level.
That's correct.
And so we leave it to them, don't we, Lecia? They're the ones who designate. They have the power to designate whether it's a hate crime or not, right?
That is correct. That is correct.
Yeah.
That is correct.
So that's where the training comes in. Because so I can hypothesize then, that there are plenty of places around the country, plenty of jurisdictions where there may be a history of hate crimes and hate groups, but you may have law enforcement in charge and in control and in power to sweep it under the rug and not even bother to designate it as a hate crime.
That's absolutely correct. That's even in states that have hate crime laws, right? It's up, as you say, it's up to the individual jurisdiction whether or not they investigate it as a hate crime in the first place to be able to prove it or not, right? And oftentimes it's the latter. They want to close the case. There may even be pressure from a prosecutor's office. Well, I don't think we can prove this hate crime enhancement, so let's just charge them with the whatever they committed as far as the crime, right? And not pursue it any further.
So to be clear, states where there are hate crime laws are still at times not able to go forward because it's easier to prove the actual crime than to prove also it was a crime of hate. Do all of these hate crime laws and statutes, are they universally, even state to state, are they universally ones that require intent as well?
Yeah, all hate crimes require that you prove that the primary motivation for the commission of the crime was hate or bias. What differs from state to state are the different characteristics, identity characteristics that are covered. Typically, most states cover race, cover nationality, cover religion. Not all states cover sexual orientation or gender identity. That's when kind of it varies a little bit. And I want to also say that I don't want to kind of like just give the impression that all law enforcement is not trying. They often do. You may remember the heinous hate crime that took place in Maryland, where Richard Collins, the young man that was about to graduate from college, he was in ROTC, and he was brutally murdered at a at a bus stop. And law enforcement wanted to add a hate crime enhancement to the crime, and then they just weren't able to prove it. And I remember I was really struck by it because it was an African-American woman, law enforcement officer, who felt so bad that they weren't able to prove it, but made a commitment that they would keep investigating that case until they were able to prove that it was a hate crime. And they did just that. So oftentimes it requires that extra work, it requires that extra investigation to be able to prove motivation.
Yeah. Do we need to change that? The motivation requirement, is that something that is problematic in getting prosecutor?
I think the real problem is one, requiring mandating law enforcement agencies to report first, right? Because that's a problem. A hate crime has been committed in an area. Say, for instance, in 2018, the 2018 hate crimes report, Charlottesville, Virginia reported no hate crimes at all. And we all know that Heather Heyer was killed during the Unite the Right rally. Now that just shouldn't be, right? So let's mandate that all hate crimes that occur must be reported to the FBI. Then let's also mandate that law enforcement agencies are trained, and law enforcement officials are trained on how to investigate hate crimes. And that they're presented with all the tools and resources they need to be able to prove that. It's not impossible. It requires more work, right? And I want to believe anyway, that our law enforcement officials would want to do that. They just need the training to do it. And then, of course, in any head of a chief of an agency should not be able to determine whether or not that agency is going to pursue hate crime investigations. It should
Right.
be, that should be mandatory as well.